Did Abraham obey the same commandments God gave to Moses? Now, according to the Bible, hundreds of years before the commandments were given at Mount Sinai, a man named Abraham lived. Now, Abraham was significant to the people of the Old Covenant because he was their biological ancestor. He's also an important role model for us today, those of us who are followers of Christ, because he is the model of faith for those of us who are under the new covenant. If we go back to Genesis 26 verse 5, we're told, Abraham obeyed me and kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. Now the phrasing there in that verse is worthy of some in-depth attention. The Hebrew word for requirements is mizmarti. The Hebrew word for commandments is miswote. And the Hebrew word for decrees is hukote. This is precisely the way the Bible refers to obeying God under the Sinai covenant. If we go to Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 1, we read this: Love the Lord your God and keep his requirements, that's mizmarti, his decrees, hukote, his laws and his commandments, mizwote. The logical conclusion from this correlation of the words is that the same set of instructions is being referred to in both places. And it is reasonable to conclude that Abraham therefore knew about what we call today the 10 Commandments, and much more. Plus, and this is very important, he followed these instructions. He kept God's requirements, commands, decrees, and laws. And if Abraham, who is the father of the faithful, obeyed the commandments, shouldn't you and I? Abraham is an illustration, an example to us all. He's a person who displays that the law of God is written on his heart. And we read about that as one of the foundational concepts of the new covenant. We first read about it in Jeremiah 31, verse 33, and then we see it quoted again in the book of Hebrews. In this way, Abraham serves as the Bible's model for how the laws of God and faith interact. Abraham's faith led him to obey God's commandments, which, again, are the same foundational spiritual laws that were later given to the nation of Israel at Mount Sinai. And these are the same laws that you and I, as followers of Christ, are to have written on our hearts. Now, when we look at the first 5 books of the Bible, it's very clear that Israel also received instructions concerning the symbolic tabernacle ceremonies, priesthood, sacrifice, and national administrative laws. And these are instructions which were not applicable to Abraham in his day. At that time, there was no tabernacle. There was no holy nation. Now, Abraham did understand the need for sacrifice, but we don't have any details about how they were conducted. Now, these instructions about tabernacle ceremonies, sacrifice, priesthood, and national administrative laws are not applicable to individual Christians like you and me today. These were regulations for how a physical nation without God's Spirit would operate. For one thing, a physical temple is no longer the center of our worship as it was in the ancient nation of Israel. Take a look at John chapter 4, verses 19 through 21. Now this is an encounter that Jesus has with a woman here, a Samaritan woman. And if we pick it up in verse 19, "Sir," the woman said, she's addressing Jesus, "I can see that you are a prophet." Now, our ancestors, and by that she would be referring to the Samaritan people, worshipped on this mountain. That's Mount Gerizim. But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is Jerusalem. Now, rather than getting into a dispute about the validity of Samaritan worship versus Jewish worship, Jesus answers this way. He says, "Woman, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." Now, another good verse to go to for this concept that our worship is no longer centered in a place named Jerusalem. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 5. Peter writes here, "As you," and in that way he's speaking to you and to me, "as you come to him, the living stone," that will be Jesus, "rejected by humans, but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." So there are a couple of examples where we see that a physical temple is no longer the center of our worship, as it was in the ancient nation of Israel. Secondly, the chosen people of God are no longer a political entity, a holy nation that you can find on a map in a geography book. Rather, they are a spiritual body. Go to 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. Now, Peter, this is following up from what we read earlier in this same chapter. Peter goes on and says, "But you," and this would be speaking to followers of Christ, those who are part of the church of God, "you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." So again, the chosen people of God are no longer a political entity like the nation of Israel. Rather, they are a spiritual body. One last point, instructions about sacrifices and priests, which we find a lot of in the first 5 books of the Bible. Those instructions about sacrifices and priests were changed under the new administration brought about by Jesus Christ. To look at that scripturally, go to Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12, where we read, "For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe." This is speaking about Jesus being of the tribe of Judah, not Levi. And, as a member of the tribe of Judah, rather than Levi, he wouldn't really technically qualify as a priest, but he is priest. So something's changed. It says that he whom these things are said about belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. So something is changing. The priesthood is changing. It's being put under a new administration. Take also a look at chapter 9 and drop to verse 9, where it says, "This is an illustration for the present time, indicating that the gifts and sacrifices being offered were not able to clear the conscience of the worshiper. They are only a matter of food and drink and various ceremonial washings, external regulations applying until the time of the new order. That time is the time of the new covenant." In conclusion, we can see that Abraham knew about God's requirements, commands, and decrees, which define righteous attitudes and behavior. Furthermore, he obeyed them because he believed what God told him. And these are the same requirements, commands, and decrees defining righteous attitudes and behavior that were given to Israel at Mount Sinai. And these are the same laws that new covenant believers like you and me are to follow, to obey, and to have written on their hearts.